Hey everyone, it's Sean from Crafted Elements, and in this video we're going to be looking at the Crafted Elements second generation of our juice groove jig, the Juice Groove Jig V2. Once you open up the shipping box, you will find 4 panels with threaded rods on the end, and you'll also get a bag with 4 knobs. Things are fairly easy to put together. You've probably seen the video, and they essentially just kind of line up like this. All right, kind of like that. They go together in like a box shape, and then you attach your knobs. Now, this is a second generation of these jigs. We had originally made them out of 1/2-inch acrylic, which is a really cool material, but it's expensive, and with enough pressure, it can bend. So that was one of the things that our customers had provided feedback on, that it would be nice if they were a little bit more rigid. So we've moved to this 3/4 inch thick, which is obviously a thicker material, hardwood plywood. And this particular one that we're using has a melamine surface just to make it a little bit smoother and reduce the dust that could collect on the inside of this jig. Okay, cool, I got a box. Now the trick to this is really just using your spacers, which are not included, and holding it down. Now I'm going to tell you in a second why you need to use the spacers, but the key is that you're going to be adjusting this to the width and length of whatever board or panel you're going to be putting in here, and then the spacers are providing an offset. Now let's say this is your cutting board that you want to put a juice groove in, and what you'll notice is if you put this thing all together and kind of tighten it up and get it really tight to the board, okay, that's all fine and dandy. However, if you're using a trim router and it comes with your little tiny 3 or 3.5 inch diameter router plate, or using our beefier 6-inch diameter router plate for your trim router, you're going to end up with a juice groove way farther into your board than you need. If you're using, say, a 6-inch base, obviously you've got 3 inches from the center of the bit to the perimeter, which means your groove is going to be 3 inches from the in from the edge. If you're using a 3-inch base, you're going to be 1.5 inches in from the edge. So regardless of the base size you're using, you're probably going to be in there too far. Juice grooves are typically 1 inch or even 3/4 inch from the edge. So assuming we're going to do 3/4 of an inch and we have a 3-inch diameter or a 6-inch diameter, which is a 3-inch radius, we're going to take that 3-inch radius, we're going to deduct the 0.75 that we want from the edge, and we'll end up with 2.25. So we're going to cut some 2.25 inch wide scrap pieces of wood, strips, or whatever. All you need to remember is the thickness of that wood should be the same size or thinner than whatever, boards or stock you're cutting. You don't want a thicker piece that's going to raise up above the perimeter, because then the juice groove jig is not going to work. If you're working with, say, 1-inch thick charcuterie boards, you can use 1-inch thick, 3/4 inch thick, 1/2 inch thick, whatever, but not 1.5 inch thick. Okay, it's a lot of numbers there, but let's just go through another example. If you were using that 3-inch diameter router base, say that one that came with your router, and again you wanted to have a 1-inch offset from the juice groove jig, and you've got 1.5 on a radius, right? 1.5 from the perimeter to the center of the bit, you're really just going to end up with, 1.5 minus 1, 0.5 inches, right? So 0.5 inch spacers. That's why you don't include spacers with these, because it really is dependent on the diameter of your router plate. And you want to use a circular or square router plate. Don't use anything crazy, because you want to be able to keep consistency across that jig the entire way. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut some 2.25 inch wide spacers here. Now in terms of the length, it's pretty much arbitrary. You want to make 4 pieces. Generally you're going to have 2 longer pieces and 2 shorter pieces, because you're typically cutting longer on one edge and shorter on the other. The key is that they are shorter than the piece you are working with. So if you are typically cutting 10-inch pieces or 10-inch wide boards, don't make 12-inch wide spacers, because then the thing is not going to close up, right? So in this case, these will work. Kind of just eyeballed the length. You want to just make sure that there's some gaps left still. All right. And now we have those spacers in place. You can see once we put our router down, we are that 0.75 inches from the perimeter, thanks to those spacers. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is actually keeping this in place. So what you're going to want to do is grab a square, and then just make sure that before you tighten this thing up, And by the way, tighten it up while you can still move it around while it's loose, because when it's clamped down, it's really hard to move around. So we're gonna just basically make sure this is square. We're gonna align our spacers generally center and make sure that they're tight. And then once you've got everything square and tight so that board's not gonna move, you can start tightening things, tightening the knobs up. And this isn't a process, or this isn't the step that you want to skimp out on. You want to make sure that if you've got to adjust it, then you do that. Otherwise, your juice groove jig is not going to be straight. And that's kind of the point, right? All right, I think everything's nice and tight here. I can loosen this one up a bit. All right, you can see that there's zero movement in those internal pieces. Our knobs are nice and tight. Now the easiest way to hold this down is honestly just to clamp 2 points to the side of your workbench. It's pretty rigid, so unless you're using an excessive amount of force with this, you shouldn't see any flex or deflection here. But there's another kind of more advanced way that I will show you as well. But first of all, I'm just gonna grab some standard clamps that'll fit against my workbench, and I'm kind of clamping in the corner here so we can grip 2 pieces at once. All right, you can see it's pretty strong, but I want to show you the alternative way to clamping this down. So what I have right here is a homemade T-track table. Some people have workbenches with these T-tracks already built in, but you can see that once you have a T-track table, and maybe your workbench is a T-track table, then when you get your clamps that go in the tracks, and you can clamp this at many, many points, right? All right, so really these are just 2 of the methods for holding this down, and it really is the trickiest part of this setup, because you want to make sure it's held down before you start running your router against it, or else it's going to go sideways really, really quick. But how you hold it down is really completely up to you, and it's going to be independent of, or is rather going to be dependent on your shop and workbench setup and your available clamps, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and just move this T-track table off, because most people don't have one. And I do want to show you it will work with just the basic clamping method, but leaving you with the fact that you can kind of do this multiple ways. All right, well, we're pretty much ready to go here. I've got a 1/2 inch rounded bit in here. It's a 1/4 inch shank, obviously, but it's a 1/2 inch cutter. And I've got it on center, and I've got it just a little bit, maybe 1/8 above the router plate. Depending on the power of the router you're using, maybe using a full-size router, maybe you're using something bigger than this, a quarter router. Generally, I find these cordless routers, or the ones that have the batteries, obviously a little bit less power than the ones that are corded and bigger. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do 2 passes here. I'm gonna do one with essentially 1/8, and I'm gonna come down a little bit more. But if you've got a more powerful router, you could definitely do this in one shot. So it doesn't really matter if you start in a corner or an edge. The key is that you wanna make sure that your surface of the perimeter of your router base never leaves the surface of this. If you end up out here, your juice groove is going to end up out here. That's the entire point of this jig, is to give you something to press against while you go around it. So just make sure that you're always touching the juice groove jig's walls with your router base to make sure you're successful at this. All right, I would actually say that's probably sufficiently deep for a juice groove, but if you wanted to make it deeper, obviously you can just adjust your router down a little bit more and give it another go. got our juice groove in our board or cabinet panel or whatever you're making that you want to put a groove in. Obviously, you're not just limited to a circular or a pocketed router bit. You could use a V-carve or a V-shaped router bit, or really anything to create grooves in rectangular or square boards. Now, if you want to get your hands on one of these juice groove jigs, if you don't have one already, you can go to craftedelements.com and then just go to the jigs section where you can find this juice groove jig. Now, the key takeaways here is to make sure that you are squaring this up first. Make sure you're holding it down really, really well. Give it a little tug before you start actually using your router on it, because you want to make sure it's not going to flex. And just calculate out your spacers based on the diameter of your router plate, and then of course the offset you want from your perimeter of your board or panel to figure out how wide those spacers need to be. Make sure the spacers are the same thickness or less than the stock you're dealing with. And remember, these spacers are like a one-time thing. Assuming you're doing the same sort of offset, you can use these over and over and over. You don't need to make new spacers every time, which is important to mention. All right, guys, thanks for watching.